Welcome to another episode of Christian Combatives. I'm your host and servant in Jesus Christ, Paladin Actual. Now, I saw this online today. It's a fun one. It's a list of 10 statements and commandments made up by some anonymous person called the 10 Non-Commandments. The 10 Non-Commandments. I guess the idea behind that name is that if they call this list the 10 Non-Commandments, they both strive for the authority of the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and they get to come up with something that's completely different or superior to it, an alternative to the 10 Commandments. So rather than calling it like the 10 anti-commandments or something like that, like, I don't know, they went with 10 non-commandments or 10, if it was me, I would have said 10 additional commandments, whatever. This is their dumb list. I'm just going to go through it. So anyways, I think, honestly, this isn't a new concept. I think the Satanists try to come up with this every once in a while. They try to come up with, all these Christians have this like list of how you should live your life and stuff. And why don't we come up with a superior moral list? So the other groups have tried to come up with something similar to this as well. And it's always a bit silly when pagans who believe in a subjective system of morality try to come up with a system of objective moral laws. Now, inevitably, it either comes out with just being super silly and absurd. It doesn't make any sense. Or accidentally, these groups will reference or reinforce biblical morality while trying to come up with something entirely new and contrary, different to it. Anyway, here are the 10 non-commandments. So let's get into it. The first non-commandment: be open-minded and be willing to alter your beliefs with new evidence. Now, this isn't actually a bad idea so long as you properly weigh the evidence. If you are aware of all of the evidence for a Christian worldview, such as the philosophical proofs for God, an abundance of evidence and recorded testimony about God, mountains of physical evidence to support the claims of the Bible, it would be quite foolish to then take a claim or a way of reading a piece of evidence and regard it as heavy enough to discard the entire preponderance of evidence. So yeah, it's good to look at evidence and information, to be willing to consider new perspectives in the light of those which have already been established. And if there is a conflict between this new piece and the stuff that you already know, feel free to look critically at both of them rather than just following every trendy new claim in scholarship. The second non-commandment is this: strive to understand what is most likely to be true, not to believe what you wish to be true. Now, again, this isn't necessarily terrible advice, though a lot of the time, truth isn't statistically likely. Many events in your life and in history are unique and seem unlikely if you're just looking at the numbers. Now, that being said, some people are really emotionally attached to their beliefs. Some people hate the idea that God does in fact exist and that this God would dare tell you what is right and what is wrong. But if such a God does exist, regardless of how you emotionally feel about it, it does you no good to deny this reality, even if you wish it wasn't true. The third non-commandment is this: the scientific method is the most reliable way of understanding the natural world. Which is, technically, they are named the non-commandments. This is just kind of like a statement of like, this is a fact. I'm just going to put it down. So if it's written down, it's a fact. But sure. For those questions of nature, natural processes, being able to observe, repeat, and predict is extremely useful. This is the empirical aspect of the scientific method. Now, as such, it would be entirely foolish to try to apply the scientific method to unique historical events, since you cannot observe, repeat, or predict them. They happened in the past, and if they're unique, they're not going to happen again. It would also be foolish to try to apply the scientific method to things like miracles or a miraculous event, since by definition, they are a deviation from the way things naturally are. It would also be foolish to try to apply the scientific method to the metaphysical or philosophical concepts, things like numbers and ideas, a process, or an entity that doesn't conform to the physical. Trying to measure the physical aspects of a non-physical being, for example, that's just using the wrong tool for the job. Now, finally, it would be absolutely foolish to believe that only those things which are tangible are real, since even the scientific method itself, it's not a physical object, it is an analytical method. Since, therefore, so much more than the natural physical world exists, and the scientific method can only tell us a fraction there is to know about that fraction, it is a wonderful tool, so long as you respect the limitations. The fourth non-commandment: every person has a right to control their own body. This is an interesting one. You hear this autonomy thing brought up a lot. That's what the word autonomy means, autonomos. Does every person have a right to control their own body, and to what extent? To the extent that it interacts with another person? Presumably not. Otherwise, things like murder would be legal. Aside from those times when murder is legal, like, abortion and euthanasia. But do you have a right to control your own body, even when it doesn't directly interact with others? Do you have a right, for example, to control your body to pollute, to just destroy nature, to be looters and polluters? Do you have that right to pollute? Now, presumably, even the hippies that wrote this list would oppose that. They would say, no, you don't have the right to, you don't have bodily autonomy to pollute. Well, you mean you're not directly affecting anyone. But biblically speaking, this is even more clear, that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. Your body is not an object that belongs to you that you can do with whatever you want, but rather it was bought with the price of Christ's sacrifice. Your body either belongs to sin as a slave to sin, or your body belongs to God. There is no biblical precedent for total bodily autonomy. Even the passages about things like marriage, God makes it clear that each person has given their body to their spouse to care, to nurture, to protect, to value, and even to possess. The fifth non-commandment is this: God is not necessary to be a good person or to live a full and meaningful life. It's not a commandment. It's just a claim, a truth claim. Now, this one is pretty easily false. Performing civil righteousness with the wrong motivations, with a lack of proper love for God, also known as a hatred for God, taints any action a person might do. It is not possible for an unrighteous, God-hating person to do anything righteous and God-pleasing. And as for a meaningful life, it is possible to create exaggerated meaning for less meaningful things, to live for sports or the gym or whatever. But without God, it is important to have a full life dedicated to anything eternally meaningful. Vanity, vanity. Without God, everything else is vanity. The sixth non-commandment is this: be mindful of the consequences of your actions and recognize you must take responsibility for them. I mean, this one is kind of half true. You should be aware that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, you included. And the wages of sin is death, but you can't do anything on your own to fix that. So if taking responsibility means accepting that you have the guilt for this, accepting the blame for your sin, fantastic. But you have to rely on God to provide a solution in the forgiveness of sins won by the death of Christ on the cross. The seventh non-commandment is this: treat others as you would want them to treat you and can reasonably expect them to want to be treated. It's like a really convoluted way of just rephrasing the golden rule. Though the idea of the golden rule is, of course, just as you desire to be loved, you should love others, not I would live more comfortably if no one ever confronted me with my sin, therefore I will never confront anyone else about their sin. That's not what the golden rule is all about. The eighth non-commandment is this: we have the responsibility to consider others, including future generations. This is actually excellent. We should especially consider the unborn children of future generations. Since they are so unable to defend themselves, we adults have to be their voice and their defenders. We have to be outspoken opponents of abortion without exception, which is certainly what the writer of this list had in mind, I'm guessing. The ninth non-commandment is this: there is no one right way to live. I mean, there really is only one way, one truth, and one life, and that is Christ. To live as God desires and commands, that is the only right way to live. The 10th non-commandment is this: leave the world a better place than you found it. Now, I don't think this is necessarily possible. The world is tragically afflicted with the consequences of sin and will continue to get worse until the return of Christ. The only one who can stem that tide is God himself, though, of course, that's certainly no excuse for us to try to make the world a worse place. A world with more Christians is a better world than one without, so I guess the takeaway from this list should be that we should be preaching Christ and him crucified to the whole world in love, not being indifferent to the beliefs that are missing the joy of the gospel, but rather finding ways to bring these unbelievers to the truth. So if you want to take away from this list that you should preach Christ, preach the gospel to all the world, make the world a better place, or at least stop the world from being a worse place as fast as it possibly can, sure, that could be a positive takeaway from this list. But anyways, that's it for the list. God bless you all and take care.